Welcome to Unusual Stories. Stories about the strange, stories about the unknown, but stories that are somehow familiar. Today I will be telling the tale of the artist that became duckweed. Duckweeds are small, free-floating, aquatic perennials that combine to form a green carpet on the surface of the water. Without knowing, you have more than likely seen duckweed many times in your life, particularly if you grow up in places like England. Duckweed is a plant which will cover the entirety of a surface of a body of water. If something were to interrupt that surface, then therefore it would interrupt that duckweed. For instance, say a log was to one time fall into a pond full of the weed, and the overall surface area of the water was to grow as it was displaced by the water, then that would mean that the duckweed also would grow. If the log was then removed and the surface area of the water was to decrease, then that would mean the amount of duckweed growing in the pond would also decrease. This duckweed grows in many places, but for this story, we'll be talking about how it grows in the Grand Union Canal in the outskirts of London. Our story starts with a young artist. They had been studying psychogeography, how people and their everyday movements can interact with the world around them. To look more closely at this, they started walking up and down the Grand Union Canal, specifically the Paddington branch, near to North Acton and Ealing. Now these are relatively uneventful suburbs of London, just another area for people to live so that they could commute in and out of the big city to earn a living and to pay their rent. When you reach Paddington and closer into central London, the boats become richer, posher, bigger, and more well-maintained, whereas the further out you go, the more the boats seem to be dilapidated, half-sunk, and even sometimes completely under the water. Now, this artist was walking up and down this same canal every day, trying to see how many differences they could find on a day-to-day basis, making a particular effort to try and see new things. The idea being that with psychogeography, you could end up walking up and down the same place every single day, like a commute to work, without ever noticing anything different. That you may be guided around by city streets and not really notice the world around you, and only when you start looking around do you start noticing how much the world sprawls around. There was an example of the urban card game where psychogeographers would walk around and start noticing cards that had been discarded. I'm sure everyone has seen a playing card every now and then on the side of the road, and these artists decided that they would play a large game of poker using only the cards that they had found on the sides of the road. Every time they find one, it goes into their hand, and then they relay this back to the other people playing the game, and everyone then has to try and find another one. Now, walking down this canal road every day, there were subtle human differences. Some canal boats moved, some fires were lit and burn out, some people entirely leave and just put much of the stuff that they had littering their shallow canal boat on the side of the water so that people could take it for free, though more often than not it was little more than discarded books no one would read, dirty crockery, and what amounted to essentially litter. Whereas in other places there were boats that would stay for long periods of time. Sometimes it seemed like these boats were staying almost indefinitely. Now, of the boats that stayed, there was one that was particularly interesting. The artist was walking down the canal, as they had done many a time, and this time they brought with them a camera. They were looking to photograph the different people that frequented the canal path. Now, there was a man who owned a boat. He was one of the people that stayed there and one of the people that was regularly seen. His boat had clearly been hand-painted, adapted, changed, built on, and on the outside even had a fence pegged into the ground where he could keep his dogs, and in the back of the boat there were cages for many birds. The man had built a small throne for himself even, just on the shore by his boat, and very rarely seemed to be anywhere other than the canal path. In walking every day, the artist had only seen them going to a local Sainsbury's that was on the waterfront, and then back to their boat. The artist wanted to photograph the man. He wanted to photograph him in front of his boat, a record of who he was and what was clearly, to some extent, his life's work. Not to be rude, the artist asked if he could have a photo before just taking one. And to his surprise, the man was incredibly upset. He didn't want his photograph taken. He didn't want to be seen, though he said that the artist could take as many photos of his boat that they would like, saying that it's not him that needs to be remembered, but his art. In his words, his boat was the important thing. He went on to also say that his dogs were just as important and therefore could also be photographed, but he himself did not need to be remembered. This caught the artist off guard. They had been studying for a while, and in their experience, a lot of the artists and people in the industry that he knew had at least some desire to be remembered, that they wanted to be known for what they'd done. And in fact, throughout art history, a lot of art that we cherish comes from the story and the person that made it, rather than just the art itself. Art without background generally tends to be unremembered. It's a human element. We want to connect with these things, and we want to connect with the people around us. We want to feel like there's someone out there who understands quite what we're going through, but has perhaps been able to put it into something visual or physical that we haven't been able to do. The artist had already been struggling with imposter syndrome. They didn't feel like they belonged in the art world that they were in. They were still trying to find their place, and having seen something that was so pure, something that was so just for the act of creating, not for fame, not for recognition, but simply for one man's enjoyment of his dogs and his birds and his boat. It made them question what was the point. What was the point of the things that they were creating? In a world that has so many things already, what's the need to make more? And in making more, are you not just perpetuating people wanting more? And is that not part of the problem? These thoughts rolled and rolled around the artist's head, trying to in some way separate the want to make something that people enjoy from the narcissism that can come from wanting to be remembered as the person who created the thing that brought so many people joy. Was that really what they wanted? Was that really who they wanted to be? They never thought before that perhaps this was all just a cry for attention in some weird way. They had told themselves that it was just a want to create. And so they started looking smaller. Rather than trying to be broad and academic with their psychogeography, their design theory, they decided to look smaller. They had been using the canal as a metaphor, an idea to try and illustrate how people move through life. But instead, they wanted to go smaller. Look at the life that moved through the canal. It seemed far more interesting to look at the minutiae. They no longer felt the draw to the big, the broad, and, well, fame. Instead, they wanted to look at the small. They wanted to just look at life, the life of the people and the things on the canal. They began to look at the canal itself. The birds, the plants, the trees, the way the water and the boats and everything moved together, almost like a community. They started to notice the duckweed. On the sides of the canal, duckweed grew, but it very rarely grew in the middle. This was because as the boats came through, it all got pushed aside, and the duckweed learned not to grow in places where it would be struck by the traffic of the shallow boats moving through the canal. There was a particular area that seemed to grow duckweed more than any other. It was probably one of the last areas where there were many still boats in an unkept part of the river before you started reaching Little Venice and then Paddington. The path goes under an overpass, covered in graffiti, with some gravel at one side and a number of canal boats at the other. Not one of the more scenic parts of this path. But it wasn't the scene that the artist was looking for, it was the duckweed. They sat, and they stared, and they stared, and they stared. They started to notice small patterns in the weed. Was it intentional, or was it just nature? Like the Fibonacci sequence, was this just the way that things grew? Day after day, they would keep coming back to the canal like they had been, and day after day they would pay more and more attention to the duckweed. Looking for tiny changes, looking for shapes, looking for ways that it had morphed, looking for images that it was looking to produce, and they started becoming less and less able to differentiate between what was their pareidolia and apophenia and what was genuinely a decision made by the duckweed to make a pattern, if you could say that a decision had been made. The artist started spending hours each day drawing the duckweed, drawing the patterns that they could find. They stopped seeing the people that they knew and loved. They stopped talking to the people that had called them or messaged them. They'd stopped interacting with their parents. They'd stopped interacting with their family members. They had become obsessed with duckweed. They couldn't sleep some nights, wondering what the next patterns would be, what they would find the next day. There was no way they had seen everything yet. It was like the surface of another planet. It was like a whole new world, a whole rolling field of things to discover, all green, all patterned, all flat, but yet textured. Their room became plastered. They kept trying to find ways to make better records of the weed itself. They were thinking of making prints, fishing it out of the water, drying it out, and then rubbing it in ink, and then pressing it against paper, so each time they could have a record of what had been done that day. But unfortunately, in doing so, that would mean that they would have to destroy that part of the duckweed. They didn't want to destroy any of it, because if they were to destroy a part of it, that part could have been a crucial element of the pattern for the next day. To take that away meant that they might be missing out on something even better. Every single pattern could be improved the next day, they just didn't know how, and they just wanted to see how that would be done. They were at a loss. They wanted to be part of this. They wanted to be as good an artist as the duckweed. They wanted to be part of something bigger. They wanted to lose themselves to become the art. They had lost all want or hope of being remembered, of being famous, and instead wanted to create in a way that was as pure as the man with the birds and the duckweed on the water. One night, they took themselves down to the canal. This wasn't a smart idea. The canal is not the safest place at night. It's a singular path. If you find someone who has ill intentions, the chances of you being able to escape are incredibly slim. You can't run off to either side other than jumping in the water. Though they decided to brave it anyway. They carried on down, looking out for duckweed under the soft glow of the moon, trying to find where the next pattern would be. They carried on down to their favourite spot underneath the overpass, where the duckweed grew freely amongst the stationary ships. They couldn't quite see the patterns. They forgot to bring a torch, or anything that could illuminate the duckweed in the water. There isn't a particularly decent light source on this side of the water here either. They leaned in and leaned in until their nose was but an inch from the water. Now bear in mind, the sides of the canal were already about half a foot away from the surface of the water, so they were leaning far further than they should have been, and, as you can expect, a mild slip as they repositioned their legs, and into the water they fell, plunging beneath the cold water's surface They had come to the other side. They were no longer viewing what the duckweed was producing, but they were instead viewing the duckweed's hard work. The tangled roots that held each other together to make these patterns, to make this surface, this world of thinking, weaving, and tying together that goes completely unnoticed on the surface. They themselves had not thought about this level of work before. They had only thought about the end result. They realized that they had been ignoring everything that had been poured in to what the duckweed was doing, and had only been looking at what the duckweed had completed. They had no interest in returning. They wanted to be part of this work. They wanted to be part of what the duckweed was doing. And so they stayed under the water, cold and wet. They put their hands up to the roots of the duckweed, not pushing them out to the surface, but just holding their hands delicately against the roots. They stayed in the water. They didn't want to leave. As they held their hands against the roots of the duckweed, they felt their fingers spreading. They felt their fingers untangling. They felt all of the tiny little grooves in their fingerprints begin to unravel, spiraling outwards, creating tendrils of their own creation. It moved from their fingers to their palms, to their wrists, to their forearms and elbows. Their entire body untying itself from what it was and becoming something new. Something simple. Something green. Something flat. The artist slowly tied themselves and wove themselves into the roots of the duckweed below the surface of the water. Once they had ingratiated themselves with the plant, they found that they could take some form of control, though it wasn't control as you and I would know it, not like moving an arm or darting your eyes around. This was more of an influence, as if their thoughts had gathered with the thoughts, if you can call them that, of the plant. They used this influence to create new patterns, new things in the duckweed that hadn't been seen before. They began to organize. The things that the artist had learnt began to present themselves in the weeds. None of this, of course, was conscious from the artist, and of course none of this was conscious from the weed, each one influencing the other in completely imperceivable ways to one another, only perceivable by the people stood on the surface. An old lady was walking along the canal one day. It was a nice path for her, lovely and flat, no stairs, no ramps, nothing to trip her over, and usually she could have pleasant conversation with the people on the canal boats going along their merry way. For London, it was to her a very genial and pleasant place. The parks had been too full of young people and drinkers, and the city streets, of course, were far too busy. But the canal was nice and calm. She was walking along, and she came to the overpass. Looking around, looking at the ducks swimming in the water, looking at the nice canal boats that had moored up for the summer, and she noticed a patch of duckweed. And in this patch of duckweed, there seemed to be a pattern that she recognized, because it matched a jacket that she had at home. Somehow, the duckweed had arranged itself into a houndstooth pattern. She marvelled at it for a moment, but went along her merry way, thinking it just a random act of nature. The next day, some young boys were cycling down the canal. Who knows to where, who knows what intention they had, but they were cycling down, and one of them stopped for a moment to tuck his shoelace back into his shoe, and looking at the duckweed, noticed a twill pattern. A diamond twill. Now the boy didn't know what diamond twill was, he didn't know the name of the pattern of course, but he could certainly see that a pattern had been formed. He told his friends that this plant was making weird squares. They all came over to look at it for a moment, but weren't particularly intrigued by the entire thing. It seemed just a strange novelty. As the days went by, more patterns emerged and more people started to notice. The patterns became more intricate and detailed, though never showed anything human necessarily, never showed anything anyone would recognize, though they always had concentric patterns, circles that interlinked, squares that seemed to go up and down within themselves, creating something that looked like it was both spreading outwards and falling inwards. Optical illusions that made it look like the water was somehow dipping into itself, impossibly breaking the surface of the water. The more patterns emerged, the more people came. The anomaly, the duckweed that could make patterns, started to become a bit of a thing of intrigue. Pictures were taken and shared of each pattern each day. Prints were available of previous days' patterns. People would wake up early in the morning just to run down to the edge of the canal under the overpass to see what new pattern had been formed each day. There was almost a sense of pride if you were the first person to get there, though people often reported that they had never actually seen the duckweed move. It was almost as if every time someone was looking away, it managed to move in a way so imperceivable that when they looked back, they wouldn't have noticed the change at all. The duckweed had started to build interest. It started to build real interest. A plan was put into the local planning department to build a small viewing area, consisting of two small wooden walkways so that people could view the duckweed from different angles. Boats travelling up and down were restricted to the very, very far side of the canal so that they couldn't interrupt the strange growing of the odd weed. People came from far away, and as part of their holiday to the already tourist-filled London, they would also head out to this small, strange area under an overpass where inexplicable plants were growing in strange patterns. People were coming in their hundreds every day to see the marvel of this plant. People had often said that it was a hoax, that there was some underwater machinery that had changed the plants every single day. So a documentary was filmed showing that no, there was in fact nothing underneath. People came from far and wide to try and debunk the magic of the duckweed, but none of them were successful. No one really could explain why the duckweed was moving in this way. Time rolled on and popularity grew. Because of the fame of the duckweed, the area around had started to raise its prices. Housing became expensive, as it was an area that had birthed a new and strange form of artist. Pubs, the restaurants and the cafes in the area started to change their names to match the duckweed. There was the Greenweed Pub, the Floating Duck Cafe. There was a small corner shop just called Duckweed Grocers. The area, beforehand somewhat anonymous and inconspicuous, had suddenly made a name for itself, or rather had a name made for it. Now this change, unfortunately, amounted to what we would call gentrification. People started seeing the area as some up-and-coming area for new artists, people looking for the strange and the unknown, and more people started moving in from other parts of the world and the richer parts of London, pushing out the pre-existing residents. Years had passed, and interest in the duckweed had started to wane. The area had grown and become famous in its own London way, similar to places like Abbey Road, where, because of something being born from that area that then went on to become renowned around the world, the area itself becomes renowned as well. People had started to lose a little bit of interest in the duckweed itself, though. People were more interested in the surrounding area. At this point, the whole area under the overpass, which used to be a free walkway for anyone, now was riddled with guards so that people couldn't upset the plants. There were people selling prints of previous days' patterns from small stands. There were people selling I Love London t-shirts and keyrings that had duckweed leaves on them, small jars containing samples of the plant, claiming that they were part of this artistic growth. Of course, none of this was true, but it was a good way to sell things to the tourists that still passed through. One morning, as one of these sellers was setting up their shop, they noticed something different. Where all the other patterns, for all this time, in the duckweed, had been just patterns. This time, it was a date. In a week's time, the date was set. A new buzz had filled this part of town. For that week, the excitement in the duckweed reached fever pitch. People had never seen it communicate before. They wondered what this date could mean. They wondered what was coming, what new thing, what new development, what new patterns would emerge. Would it just be patterns this time? Had the duckweed learnt? Had it grown internally? Had it started to figure out new things, new ways of being, new ways of drawing? Was this a second wave? Would this bring even more popularity and prosperity to the area? Was this going to bring renewed interest, more tourists, more people looking to move in? Because of this interest, something had to be done. It could no longer be something that could be viewed for free. So, boundaries were put up, fences were put down, turnstiles for visitors were put around. The pre-existing viewing platforms were stretched and built and grown as far as they could be. They closed in around the duckweed so that nothing could be missed, making sure that they didn't build over it, but also making sure that they could see absolutely all of it. They squashed it in so that the result of whatever they were making would be like a canvas. A camera was set up from above so that pictures could be taken every second, every millisecond, so that nothing was missed. No one had any idea what was coming, and everyone wanted to be a part of it. Tickets were sold at a high price. There were different prices for different viewing statuses, and everyone wanted to gather around to see it. Boats were banned completely from moving for that entire week as to not upset the plans of the plant that sat placidly in the water. For that entire week, just the date. No new patterns, nothing new. Just the date. Eventually the day rolled around. Everyone was ecstatic. People had arrived a day, 2 days early, just so that they wouldn't miss anything. There were both fanatics and critics present. The duckweed had actually gained a number of critics over the years that it had been sat in the water, some saying that its patterns were trite, overdone, already seen, too similar to ones that it had done a year or 2 years ago, that it didn't have any innovation. These critics, as critics do, were looking to find any imperfection in the result of whatever the duckweed had to show the people. Everyone gathered and in this enclosed square where the duckweed was gathered up and pressed in on itself, everyone, with bated breath, was staring at the duckweed, hoping for the next change. It was a hot summer's day. People were sweating. People were uncomfortable. People were growing impatient. As the day went on and people started to review the camera, they started to notice something. Not a pattern forming, but a changing colour. The leaves of the duckweed started to turn yellow, then brown. Then they seemed to dry out and shrivel. It happened so quickly. So quickly. Yet, because everyone was staring so intently, they never noticed the change. When change like this is gradual, it's difficult to pinpoint the moment where anything is different. By the end of the day, when the sun was finally setting, the duckweed had completely died. Squashed in by the viewing platforms and the people looking to see what it was going to come out with next, the duckweed had choked. It couldn't survive in such a small space. It needed to spread its roots and grow, but people were so intent on containing it so they could see what it was going to do, they had unfortunately also contained its roots. The people were disappointed. But not massively. The interest in the duckweed had already gone. For the next few days, the local papers had, I guess, what could be considered memorials for the duckweed, lamenting that it was underappreciated and that its work would go on and be remembered forever. The prices of the prints of previous patterns steadily started to grow, but then plateau and then decrease again as more and more of these prints were produced. A sign was erected showing where the duckweed used to be. Videos of its entire lifespan, or at least what people had recorded of it, were put into a local museum. And there were even some of the samples that were sold by the people at the booths that had, for some reason, been misidentified as genuine parts of the artistic duckweed. Again, put into small museums so that people could see what it used to be like. There was even a recreation made, some form of mechanical version with plastic leaves attached to string in a small pond in the garden of said museum that would each day move around by a set of pulleys underneath the water, making a new pattern. The area itself, well, it stayed prosperous. It had the memory of the duckweed. People still wanted to visit there. It had become a pleasant place to be, and people wanted to live there more than ever. The houses grew and were more done up. The shops changed from local butchers and off-licenses and grocers to more well-known chain stores. High-end chain stores, but chain stores nonetheless. The thing that built the town, the duckweed, was no longer there. But its memory was more important to the people around than the duckweed itself. While it still existed, people had lost interest. But now that it was gone, people remembered it more fondly than ever. People almost lamented the fact that they had never gone down to see it for themselves, or that they just knew it was there. My name is Adam Cademan. I thank you again for listening to this new and experimental storytelling that I've been doing. I hope that you enjoy, and if anyone has any pointers, any tips, or anything that they think can be done better, please leave a comment down below. I would love to read them. If you enjoyed this, of course, please send any well wishes as well. If you disliked this story, keep it to yourself.